Get your dirty hands away from that glass boy. You people should know your place. Julian Vance grabbed the 14-year-old by his collar and shoved him backward. Carlos, I do not pay you to bring your street kid to work. This is a high-end restoration facility, not a charity shelter. He threw a heavy floor buffer rag at Mateo's feet. Make yourself useful. Polish the baseboards. That is all your kind is good for anyway. The restoration experts laughed. 14 grown men with advanced engineering degrees watching a child be humiliated. Not one spoke up. Carlos rushed over his work, worn hands trembling as he gripped his son's shoulders. His tired eyes begged the boy, "Please, not here, not now. We need this job." Mateo picked up the rag. He did not say a word, but his gaze never left the massive glass case in the center of the room or the mechanical marvel resting inside it. Have you ever been dismissed because of how you looked, not what you knew? The celestial maestro sat under the harsh, sterile lights of the Manhattan Private Museum, like a king frozen in time. Outside, a massive winter blizzard whipped against the reinforced windows, howling through the New York night. Inside, the air was thick with tension, the smell of industrial solvents and expensive coffee. The maestro was an 18th century automaton, a life-sized mechanical man crafted from gold, silver, and over 4,000 microscopic brass gears. It sat at a beautifully carved wooden piano, its hands hovering over the keys. When fully functional, it was designed to play a complex classical sonata, its fingers moving with the grace of a living musician, its chest rising and falling as if it were breathing. It was one of only 2 ever built in the world. Its value was completely incalculable, easily worth more than what most people would earn in 10 lifetimes. Arthur Pendelton stood beside the glass case, his posture rigid, his eyes hollow and dark. The 70-year-old tech billionaire had built Pendelton software from a tiny garage project into a global empire. He controlled server farms, artificial intelligence networks, and a fortune measured in the tens of billions. But none of his money, none of his advanced technology mattered right now. His wife, Eleanor, had bought this automaton 3 years ago. She was a master antique restorer, a woman who loved the whisper of old clockwork more than the noise of modern life. She had spent 2 years carefully bringing the maestro back to life, cleaning its gears, replacing its worn-out springs. It was her final masterpiece. She wanted to hear it play its song for their 40th wedding anniversary. 6 months before the anniversary, Eleanor passed away. A sudden illness, fast, quiet, and devastating. The automaton became everything to Arthur. It was a time machine, a conversation with a ghost. The very last thing Eleanor had touched. If he could just hear the song she had worked so hard to revive, he felt he could hear her voice one last time. The maestro was the only bridge left between Arthur and the love of his life. But for 14 months, that bridge had been broken. The problem started near the end of the song. The machine would play flawlessly, a beautiful, haunting melody pouring from the wooden piano. But right at the 89th note, it would hesitate. The mechanical fingers would tremble. A tiny, painful clicking sound would echo from deep inside the brass chest, and the machine would seize up completely. Arthur had brought it to the Vance Restoration Institute, the most exclusive high-tech restoration center on the East Coast. Julian Vance ran the facility. He had Ivy League credentials, advanced degrees in microengineering, and a reputation for using state-of-the-art laser scanning and artificial intelligence software to fix priceless historical artifacts. The first diagnosis took 4 weeks. The bill came to $65,000. Mainspring tension imbalance, Julian announced with absolute certainty. Problem solved. It was not solved. 2 weeks later, the hesitation returned. The 89th note failed again. The fingers locked. The music died. Arthur brought it back. Another deep diagnostic run, another massive bill. $120,000. Pneumatic cylinder friction, Julian declared. We completely rebuilt the air valves. You will not have any more issues, Arthur. He was wrong. Over the next 14 months, Arthur Pendelton shipped the maestro to the best engineers in Geneva, the top watchmakers in London, and the most elite robotics experts in Tokyo. The bills mounted into the millions. Computer diagnostics, ultrasonic gear mapping, 3-dimensional laser scanning. Every expert said the exact same thing. We cannot find anything mechanically wrong. But something was wrong. Arthur could hear it in that agonizing click. The machine was crying for help, trapping his wife's final melody inside its golden chest, and no one, not even the smartest engineers on Earth, understood its language. Now he stood in Julian Vance's sterile white laboratory, listening to Julian deliver the same empty promises. "Our artificial intelligence models have conducted a comprehensive millimeter scan," Julian said, smoothly adjusting his designer glasses. "We have identified several potential microscopic friction points." "Stop." Arthur's voice was quiet, heavily burdened by grief. "I have heard this speech before, Julian. From you, from a dozen others. Just tell me the truth." Julian's confident, polished smile flickered for a second. "The truth, Arthur, is that this mechanism is over 200 years old. The metals are fatigued. Some problems simply cannot be solved by modern science. Perhaps it is time to consider other options. Let it be a static display." "Do not." Arthur's eyes went dangerously cold. "Do not tell me to give up on her." In the dark corner of the laboratory, Matteo polished the floorboards. The heavy rag moved in slow, methodical strokes. His body performed the manual labor automatically, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. He watched the technicians huddle around the golden automaton. He heard fragments of their conversation. They used complex technical terms that would confuse most adults, let alone a 14-year-old boy. Torsional strain kinetic binding, algorithmic stress variance. Matteo understood every single word. He had learned this language in a dark, dusty alleyway across the city. He had learned it from a blind man whose hands had shaped the most intricate timepieces in the world. He had learned it through 4 years of patient, hidden teaching that nobody in this room knew about. The technicians were preparing to run another test. They wound the main key. Matteo kept polishing the floor. He kept his head down. He kept being invisible, but he was listening. As the machine began to play, the haunting melody filled the room. The technicians stared at their glowing computer monitors, watching green and red graphs spike and fall. They were looking for the problem with their eyes. Matteo closed his eyes. Because of his rare synesthesia condition, sound was not just something he heard, it was something he saw. The music painted colors in his mind. The piano notes were deep, rich shades of blue and silver. The turning of the internal brass gears were steady pulses of warm amber. It was a beautiful, perfectly synchronized painting of sound. Note 80, note 85, note 88. Suddenly, the color in Matteo's mind shifted. A microscopic hesitation in the gear rhythm. A sharp, jagged flash of sickly yellow cut through the warm amber. It was so incredibly brief that the multi-million-dollar electronic sensors rounded it off as normal background noise. It was so subtle that the trained engineers standing 2 feet away noticed absolutely nothing. Matteo's hand stopped moving. He knew that jagged yellow sound. He had heard it once before in his teacher's workshop. An antique grandfather clock with a problem that had stumped the best repairman in the city for decades. The memory surfaced clearly. The scarred, blind hands of his teacher pointing to a tiny, hidden access point. His gentle voice explaining how certain alloys reacted to their environment. How modern testing often ignored the very nature of old materials. Matteo opened his eyes and looked at the celestial maestro. He traced the mechanical pathways in his mind, ignoring the computer screens and the laser scanners. He looked at the way the room's harsh modern lights cast cold shadows on the ancient metal. He knew what was wrong. The machine was not broken. It was suffocating. The music played. The celestial maestro began its performance, its golden fingers dancing across the beautiful wooden keys of the antique piano. The melody was a haunting, complex sonata composed in 1791. For a brief, magical moment, the sterile white laboratory with its harsh fluorescent lights faded away. Arthur Pendelton closed his eyes. He was no longer a billionaire chief executive standing in a high-tech facility. He was back in his own living room on a quiet Sunday afternoon, sitting on the velvet sofa watching his wife Eleanor smile as she carefully polished the intricate brass workings of the automaton. He could almost hear her soft laughter. He could almost smell her signature lavender perfume. Then came the 88th note. The machine took a mechanical breath. Its chest cavity expanded perfectly. Its internal gears shifted with a rhythmic pulse. The 89th note approached. Click. The golden fingers froze mid-air. The internal gears ground against each other with a sickening metallic scrape that echoed loudly across the room. The beautiful, sweeping melody died, instantly replaced by the loud, sterile humming of Julian Vance's massive computer servers. Arthur opened his eyes. The illusion shattered into pieces. His wife was still gone, and her final masterpiece was still broken. "Fascinating," Julian murmured. He was staring intensely at a glowing holographic display that hovered above his massive desk. He typed rapidly on his illuminated keyboard. "The structural integrity scan shows no obvious physical fractures. My artificial intelligence model suggests we might be dealing with a quantum-level degradation in the primary drive shaft. If we extract the shaft and subject it to a supercooled liquid nitrogen bath, we might force the microscopic metal fibers to realign." Arthur stared at the frozen golden man in the glass case. He looked incredibly tired. His broad shoulders slumped, carrying the crushing weight of a billion-dollar empire and a completely broken heart. "You have been scanning this machine for 3 weeks, Julian," Arthur said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Before that, the engineering team in London used ultrasonic wave mapping. Before them, the robotics experts in Tokyo tried microscopic laser reconstruction. I have spent over $3 million on this. You have run it through the most advanced software on the planet, and you are telling me you still want to guess." "Oh, she is." Julian adjusted his expensive designer glasses. He hated being questioned by anyone. He was the smartest man in any room he walked into, and his ego was as fragile as the priceless antiques surrounding them. "Arthur, you must understand," Julian said, his tone dripping with deep condescension, sounding exactly like a strict teacher speaking to a very slow child. "We are dealing with primitive technology here. This automaton was built by candlelight using crude hammers and hand files. It is a mathematical miracle that it functions at all. Our sensors are perfect. Our diagnostic algorithms are flawless. If the computer cannot find the error is an inherent flaw in the antique design itself." Julian gestured dismissively toward the maestro. "There comes a point where even infinite wealth cannot reverse the decay of time. I strongly advise we halt these tests immediately. The constant starting and stopping is risking a catastrophic mechanical failure. Let me build a climate-controlled display case for it. We can seal it in an inert gas chamber. It will remain a beautiful silent statue forever." Arthur looked at Julian. He looked at the rows of computers, the glowing screens, and the flashing data charts. They had no soul. They did not understand what this machine truly meant. They only saw numbers and friction points. They did not see love. They did not see a final goodbye. "A silent statue," Arthur repeated. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. "It is the only logical path forward," Julian insisted smoothly. "We have exhausted every scientific avenue. There is no one on Earth who possesses better technology or deeper knowledge than this facility." Arthur slowly walked up to the thick glass case. He placed his trembling hand against the cold, clear surface. He had fought so hard. He had thrown his entire fortune at this problem, truly believing that money and modern science could fix absolutely anything. But they could not fix this. They could not bring Eleanor back, and they could not save her dying song. The fight drained out of him all at once. "I am done," Arthur whispered. The words fell heavy and final in the quiet room. Julian tried to mask his profound relief with a look of deep, practiced sympathy. "A wise choice, Arthur. I know it is difficult, but it is the right decision. I will have my team pack it into a secure transport crate in the morning. You can place it in your mansion foyer." "Do not," Arthur said, his voice suddenly cracking with emotion. "Do not tell me this is wise. This machine holds the very last piece of my wife's soul, and I am abandoning it to gather dust in a dark room." He turned away from the glass case. The great Arthur Pendelton, a man who commanded legions of employees and dictated global tech markets, looked incredibly small and utterly defeated. He began walking toward the heavy exit doors. In the dark shadows near the doorway, Matteo gripped the polishing rag. His knuckles turned white. He had felt the deep despair in the billionaire's voice. He had seen the heartbreak in his eyes. Matteo's father, Carlos, tugged nervously at the boy's sleeve. "Keep your head down, Matteo," his father whispered frantically. "Do not look at them. Just clean the floor. We need this paycheck to pay your mother's hospital bills. If you make Mr. Vance angry, he will fire me. We will be out on the freezing street." Matteo knew his father was right. The golden rule of the unseen worker was simple. Stay invisible. Stay quiet. Powerful people did not want to hear from the people who cleaned their floors. They definitely did not want to hear from a 14-year-old boy in a faded shirt and worn-out sneakers. But Matteo's mind was racing. The colors were still flashing vividly in his head. The jagged, sickly yellow tear in the blue music, the sickening click of the gears, the memory of his old blind teacher echoing loudly in his ears. "Modern men look at the metal, Mateo," the old man had said, his sightless eyes staring into the dark alleyway. But they forget to feel the air around it. They forget that metal remembers. They forget that metal breathes. This antique machine was screaming. It was suffocating under the harsh, cold lights of modern science. And absolutely nobody in this room of certified geniuses was listening to it. Mateo watched Arthur take slow, heavy steps toward the exit doors. The billionaire was leaving. In a few moments, the celestial maestro would be locked inside a wooden box forever. The song would never finish. The ghost would be trapped inside the gears. Mateo looked at his father's terrified face. He looked at Julian Vance's arrogant, smug smile. Then he dropped the rag. It hit the polished floor with a soft thud, but in the tense silence of the laboratory, it sounded like a gunshot. The sound of the heavy rag hitting the floor made Carlos freeze. He stared at his son in absolute horror. "Mateo, what are you doing?" Carlos hissed, his voice trembling. "Pick it up, right now." But Mateo stepped forward out of the dark shadows and into the harsh fluorescent light. He walked past his terrified father. He walked past the 14 highly educated technicians who were already pulling out wooden shipping crates. He stopped 10 feet away from the billionaire. "Mr. Pendelton." The voice was young, clear, and completely steady. It cut through the hum of the computer servers like a sharp knife. Arthur Pendelton stopped walking. He slowly turned around, his tired eyes focused on the thin 14-year-old boy standing in the middle of the laboratory wearing faded jeans and a shirt that was slightly too big for him. "I know what is wrong with your machine, sir," Mateo said. He looked directly into the billionaire's eyes. "The machine is not broken. It is just suffocating." Complete silence crashed through the room. For 3 long seconds, nobody breathed. Then a junior engineer in the back row let out a sharp bark of laughter. Within seconds, the entire room erupted. 14 men armed with advanced degrees from Harvard and MIT doubled over in uncontrollable laughter. The idea was absurd. A teenage janitor claiming to solve a mystery that had defeated the greatest scientific minds on the planet. Julian Vance did not laugh. His face turned a deep, furious shade of crimson. The veins in his neck pulsed. His pristine laboratory, his absolute authority, was being mocked by a street kid. "Carlos!" Julian shouted, his voice echoing violently off the white walls. "Get this insolent brat out of my sight immediately! You are fired! Pack your things and leave!" Carlos rushed forward, nearly tripping over his own feet. He grabbed Mateo's arm, his eyes wide with panic. "I am so sorry, Mr. Vance. He is just a boy. He does not know what he is saying. Please, sir, I need this job. My wife is sick. I beg you." "Mama," Mateo said quietly. He gently pulled his arm away from his father's grip. He looked at Carlos. His dark eyes were calm and completely certain. "I know I can do this, Papa. The blind man taught me. I saw the music." "Security." Julian snapped his fingers at the men by the door. "Remove them both. Now." "Stop." The word was spoken quietly, but it carried the absolute weight of a man who controlled empires. Arthur Pendelton raised one hand. The security guards froze in their tracks. The laughter in the room died instantly. "Arthur, you cannot be serious." Julian stepped forward, his polished facade cracking. "This is a child. He is the son of the floor cleaner. He has absolutely no training, no engineering credentials, and no formal education. It is an insult to the scientific process." "Julian," Arthur's voice cut like cold steel, "your scientific process and your impressive credentials have cost me $3 million and 14 months of my life. You have given me nothing but empty promises and massive bills." Arthur slowly walked back toward the center of the room. He stood right in front of Mateo. The towering billionaire looked down at the teenage boy. "What is your name, son?" Arthur asked. "Mateo, sir. Mateo Silva." "And you think you know what is wrong with my wife's automaton?" Mateo nodded slowly. "Everyone in this room has been using their eyes, sir. They are looking at computer screens. They are looking at laser scans. But the computers do not hear what I hear. They do not see the colors of the friction. Your machine is trying to tell you something, and I know exactly what it is." Julian Vance felt his absolute control slipping away. A teenage janitor was being taken seriously over his expert opinion in his own multi-million-dollar facility right in front of his entire staff. His ego simply could not allow it. If he shut the boy down now, Arthur might always wonder if the boy was right. Julian needed to crush the boy completely. He needed a public execution. "Fine," Julian said sharply, a cold, predatory smile spreading across his face. "If Mr. Pendleton wishes to entertain this absolute circus, we will do it properly. We will not hide this in the dark." Julian walked toward Matteo, looking down his nose at the boy. "I am going to call the Antique Restoration Board. I will invite the top horologists and mechanical engineers in New York City. We will arrange a formal public evaluation." Julian smiled maliciously. "1 week from today, you will have 90 minutes to diagnose the problem in front of qualified witnesses." He leaned in closer, dropping his voice to a menacing whisper that only Matteo and Carlos could hear. "When you fail, boy, and you will fail, I will make sure it is permanently documented. I will personally ensure that your father never finds work in this city again. You will be out on the street by winter." Carlos went pale. His hands shook violently. He reached for Matteo, ready to drag his son out the door and beg for mercy. They could not afford to play games with rich, powerful men. But before Carlos could speak, Matteo looked up at Julian Vance. The boy did not flinch. He thought of his mother lying in a hospital bed, telling him to always trust his heart. He thought of his blind teacher sitting in the dark, teaching him to listen to the whispers of ancient metal. "I can do this," Matteo said. His voice was louder this time, echoing off the glass case holding the silent maestro. "I accept." Carlos stopped. He looked at his son, this strange, brilliant boy who spent his weekends covered in grease in a dark alleyway. This son who saw colors and sound. Carlos looked at Julian Vance's cruel, mocking face. Then the tired father straightened his aching back. "My son does not lie, Mr. Pendleton," Carlos said, his voice finding a sudden strength. "If Matteo says he knows, he knows." The challenge was set. 7 days. News traveled fast through the high society and engineering circles of New York. A 14-year-old immigrant boy claiming to solve a historical mystery that had defeated the world's best experts. The floor cleaner's son challenging certified geniuses. Julian made sure the top journalists knew about it. He wanted a large audience for the humiliation. He wanted to destroy the boy to protect his own massive ego. He never once considered that he might be wrong. If you have ever been told you were too young, too poor, or too different to matter, stay with this story. In 7 days, Matteo Silva will face a tribunal of experts who are fully expecting him to fail. What happens next will leave every single one of them completely speechless. 4 years earlier, on a suffocatingly hot July afternoon, a 10-year-old Matteo sat on the cracked concrete steps of his apartment building in Queens. The city air was thick with humidity and the distant wail of police sirens. But Matteo was not paying attention to the noise of the street. His entire world was focused on a small wooden box in his hands. It was a broken mechanical metronome he had pulled out of a wealthy neighborhood trash can, the kind musicians use to keep time. The heavy metal pendulum was stuck. The internal spring was jammed tightly. Matteo did not have any tools. He only had a rusty paperclip and his own intense focus. He twisted the paperclip, trying to reach inside the narrow wooden casing to release the jammed gear. As he scraped the metal, he heard a harsh grinding noise, but because of his synesthesia, he did not just hear the noise. He saw it. A violent, muddy brown streak flashed across his vision. It was the color of friction, the color of pain. He stopped immediately. He knew if he forced it, the internal brass teeth would snap. "You are forcing the escapement wheel, boy. The metal is tired. It does not want to move." Matteo looked up. An old man was standing on the sidewalk just a few feet away. He wore a faded tweed suit despite the blistering summer heat. He held a white cane in his right hand. His eyes were pale and clouded over. He was completely blind. This was Elias Thorne. Long before the darkness took his sight, Elias had been a master watchmaker. He had restored timepieces for European royalty and wealthy collectors. Now he lived in the shadows of Queens, running a tiny, forgotten repair shop packed with ticking clocks that nobody else wanted to fix. Elias stepped closer, tilting his head as if listening to the air around the boy. "May I see it?" he asked softly. Matteo hesitated, then placed the wooden metronome into the old man's scarred, weathered hands. Elias did not try to open it. He did not ask for a screwdriver. He simply held the wooden box to his ear and tapped the side with one fingernail. A faint muffled rattle echoed from inside. "The mainspring is bound tight," Elias said. "Tell me, what did it sound like when you tried to force it?" Matteo looked down at his worn-out sneakers. People usually thought he was crazy when he described sounds. "It sounded like muddy brown, like something sharp tearing through thick mud." Elias froze. His cloudy eyes widened in absolute shock. He slowly lowered the metronome. In all his years of teaching apprentices, he had never heard a child describe a mechanical failure with such raw sensory accuracy. The boy was not just hearing the friction, he was feeling the exact density of the stress. "Muddy brown," Elias whispered to himself, a slow smile spreading across his wrinkled face. "Come with me, boy. I want to show you something." Elias led Matteo down a narrow alleyway and pushed open a heavy wooden door. As they stepped inside, Matteo stopped breathing. The shop was a sanctuary of sound. Hundreds of antique clocks covered the walls. Grandfather clocks, pocket watches, intricate brass automatons. They were all ticking in perfect overlapping rhythms. To anyone else, it would be a chaotic noise. To Matteo, it was a breathtaking painting. Deep blue thumps, bright silver clicks, warm amber chimes. It was a symphony of living metal. Elias walked behind his wooden workbench and picked up a heavy brass gear. He held it out to Matteo. "Modern engineers are very smart," Elias said, his voice echoing in the small shop. "They have powerful computers. They have lasers that can measure a microscopic scratch, but they all share the exact same weakness. They look at machines as dead objects. They think metal is just cold material." Elias reached out and placed his hand on Matteo's small shoulder. "But metal remembers Matteo," the blind man said passionately. "It expands in the summer heat. It shrinks in the winter cold. It scars under pressure. A gear that has been turning for 100 years carries the memory of every single rotation. The computers only look at what the metal is doing right now. They never ask what the metal has lived through." Elias handed the brass gear to Matteo. It felt heavy and cold. "Your condition is not a burden. It is a profound gift. You can see the pain in the machinery. You can hear the ghosts in the gears. Would you like to learn how to heal them?" Matteo gripped the brass gear tightly, his heart hammered in his chest. "Yes, sir," he answered, without a single second of hesitation. "More than anything." For the next 4 years, Matteo lived 2 separate lives. During the week, he went to a crowded public school, keeping his head down and his grades up. But every weekend, every holiday, and every summer vacation, he disappeared into Elias's dark workshop. His mother thought he was just staying out of trouble on the streets. She had absolutely no idea that her son was becoming a master diagnostician. Elias did not teach him using textbooks or digital screens. He taught Matteo how to diagnose complex machinery completely blindfolded. He taught him how to use an antique medical stethoscope to listen to the heartbeats of steam engines and clockwork motors. He made Matteo memorize the different resonant frequencies of copper, steel, brass, and gold. If the rhythm is a sharp silver, the tension is too high. Elias would instruct from his rocking chair, listening to Matteo work. If the rhythm turns a dull gray, the lubrication has dried out. Every machine will tell you exactly what is wrong. The only question is whether you are humble enough to listen. Matteo learned to touch microscopic springs with the delicate care of a surgeon. His hands were small, which Elias noted was a massive advantage. Matteo could reach deep inside complicated mechanisms where adult fingers could never fit. He fixed 100-year-old pocket watches that certified jewelers had declared completely unfixable. He restored singing bird boxes that had been silent for decades. He learned the deep emotional language of ancient engineering. Now standing in the modern, sterile laboratory of the Vance Restoration Institute, facing a multi-million-dollar challenge, Matteo finally understood why Elias had chosen him. All the hours spent blindfolded in that dusty shop, all the lessons about the memory of metal, it was all preparing him for this exact moment. He was not just a janitor's son holding a polishing rag. He was the last student of Elias Thorne. He was born to hear the melody that no one else could see. 7 days from now, he was going to make them all listen. 7 days later, Matteo Silva walked into the Vance Restoration Institute wearing his only nice outfit, a white button-down shirt his mother had ironed perfectly from her hospital bed, dark slacks, and a pair of polished black shoes. He looked incredibly small in the massive high-tech facility. The pristine laboratory had been transformed into a courtroom. The celestial maestro sat in the exact center under blazing theatrical lights. Rows of black folding chairs were arranged in a wide semicircle. A massive digital clock was mounted on the stark white wall, ready to count down 90 minutes. This was not an evaluation, it was an execution. Julian Vance had assembled his audience very carefully. 14 of his own senior engineers filled the first 2 rows. They wore crisp white lab coats and whispered quiet jokes to each other. 3 prominent journalists from the most prestigious antique and engineering magazines sat in the 3rd row holding their notebooks. Julian had personally promised them a highly entertaining story. The complete public humiliation of a street kid who dared to challenge modern science. Arthur Pendelton sat completely alone in the back row. He had not slept in a week. Hope was a very dangerous thing, and he had learned that lesson too many times before. Standing in the far corner, pressed tightly against the wall, was Carlos. He clutched his janitor cap in his hands, his knuckles entirely white. Every single thing they had could disappear when that digital clock hit 0. Julian Vance walked to the center of the room. He wore a custom-tailored suit and a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian said, letting his smooth voice fill the room. "Thank you for attending this highly unusual event. We are here today to witness a young boy's claim that he can diagnose a mechanical failure that has defeated the absolute best certified professionals in the world." He gestured grandly toward Matteo. "The subject will have exactly 90 minutes. He must identify the malfunction, explain his scientific reasoning, and propose a viable solution. If he fails, which logic dictates he will, his family has agreed to issue a formal public apology for wasting the valuable time of true experts." Matteo stood completely still beside the golden automaton. He could feel every single eye in the room burning into him. He could hear the condescending whispers about his age and his clothes. But his hands did not shake. His breathing was slow and deep. Elias had prepared him for the pressure of the dark. However, Julian continued pacing slowly like a predator. "Before we allow an untrained teenager to touch a priceless historical artifact, I believe we must establish a baseline of basic mechanical competency. Just a few simple questions to ensure the boy understands what a gear actually is." The engineers in the front row chuckled. Julian turned to Matteo. His smile vanished, replaced by a look of total contempt. "Tell me, boy," Julian barked. "What is the precise tensile strength and torsional limit of an 18th century carbon steel mainspring under maximum compression?" Julian expected silence. He expected the boy to stammer panic and cry. Matteo did not even blink. "An authentic 1790 mainspring possesses a tensile strength of approximately 120,000 pounds per square inch." Matteo answered, his voice ringing crystal clear across the silent room. "Its torsional limit maxes out at 45 degrees of rotation before structural fatigue begins. However, because it was forged by hand, the center coil is always slightly thicker, meaning the tension release is non-linear." Julian's confident smile tightened. He quickly fired another question. "What is the exact gear ratio required to translate a 60 rotation per minute drive shaft into a 3-second pneumatic breathing cycle for the bellows?" "A compound reduction gear train," Matteo replied instantly. "First stage is a 12-tooth pinion driving a 60-tooth wheel. Second stage is an 8-tooth pinion driving a 48-tooth wheel. That creates a total reduction of 30-to-1, turning the 60 rotations per minute into exactly 1 cycle every 3 seconds. The room went completely still. The journalists stopped smirking and started writing furiously in their notebooks. Julian took a step forward, his face flushing red. "Tolerance specifications for a brass escapement wheel operating at 85 degrees Fahrenheit. Brass expands at 19 parts per million per degree Celsius," Matteo stated calmly. "At 85 degrees Fahrenheit, an original 18th century escapement wheel with a 2-inch diameter will expand by roughly 0.0004 inches. If the pivot holes are not lubricated with an organic oil, that microscopic expansion will increase friction by 17%. Perfect. Every single answer was absolutely perfect. The senior engineers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Most of them could not have answered those questions without looking at a textbook or running a complex computer simulation. This 14-year-old boy from Queens had answered them from memory without a single second of hesitation. Arthur Pendelton leaned forward in his chair. The dark clouds in his eyes began to part, replaced by a spark of genuine curiosity. Julian Vance was furious. The pop quiz was supposed to expose Mateo's ignorance and end the challenge before it even began. Instead, it had just showcased the boy's terrifying genius to the entire room. Theoretical memorization is completely useless without practical application, Julian snapped. He pointed a shaking finger at the large digital clock on the wall. Your baseline is accepted. The real test begins now. Start the clock. The digital display beeped loudly and began counting down. 89 minutes and 59 seconds. Mateo turned toward the celestial maestro. The room held its breath. It was time to show them how to listen. The digital display on the wall flashed silently. 89 minutes. 88 minutes. Mateo did not rush. He did not walk toward the $50,000 diagnostic computers. He did not ask for the three-dimensional laser scanner. Instead, he reached into his faded canvas backpack and pulled out two objects that made the entire room stare in absolute bewilderment. The first was a vintage acoustic medical stethoscope made of heavy brass and cracked black rubber. The second was a thick white beeswax candle and a box of standard wooden matches. Julian Vance let out a loud theatrical sigh. Are we repairing a priceless historical artifact, or are we conducting a Victorian seance? What is this nonsense? The senior engineers in the front row laughed, shaking their heads. One of the journalists took a photo, clearly preparing to write a mocking article about the boy who brought a candle to a multi-million-dollar laboratory. Mateo ignored them completely. He walked up to the celestial maestro. He placed the candle on a small metal tray beside the open brass chest cavity of the automaton, but he did not light it yet. Please wind the main drive, Mateo said quietly. Let it play. A junior technician looked at Julian, who gave a dismissive wave. The technician stepped forward and turned the heavy golden key in the back of the machine. The internal springs tightened. The pneumatic bellows filled with air. The maestro began to play. The haunting, beautiful piano sonata filled the sterile white room. Mateo put the earpieces of the stethoscope into his ears. He closed his eyes. He gently pressed the cold brass bell of the stethoscope against the lower left quadrant of the machine's exposed chest plate. He was no longer in a high-tech laboratory in New York. He was back in the dark alleyway with Elias. He let the music wash over him. The synesthesia took over his senses. The deep blue piano notes rolled through his mind like ocean waves. The clicking of the escapement wheels pulsed in warm amber. He moved the stethoscope a fraction of an inch to the right. He listened deeply. He bypassed the loud, obvious sounds of the main gears and hunted for the whispers hidden underneath. Note 80. Note 85. Mateo's breathing slowed. He waited for it. Note 88. Click. The golden fingers froze. The music died. To the engineers in the room, it was just a mechanical failure. But through the acoustic brass stethoscope amplified directly into Mateo's ears, it was a violently loud scream. A jagged, blinding flash of sickly yellow tore through the blue music in his mind. He pinpointed the exact location of the color. It was buried deep beneath the primary pneumatic cylinder. Mateo opened his eyes. He pulled the stethoscope from his ears. He looked directly at the massive digital clock. 81 minutes remaining. I found it, Mateo said. Julian crossed his arms, his face twisted in a patronizing sneer. Oh, you found it, with a piece of rubber tubing from 1920. Fascinating. Please enlighten the greatest engineering minds on the East Coast. What did our supercomputers miss? Your computers missed the environment, Mr. Vance, Mateo said calmly. He reached out and traced his finger in the air, pointing to a microscopic brass pivot wheel tucked deep inside the chest cavity. The failure is happening right there. The secondary tension pivot for the 89th note release valve. Julian laughed out loud. That is impossible. We laser scanned that exact pivot wheel 3 times. The structural integrity is flawless. The brass is in perfect condition. There is absolutely no friction point. You are right, Mateo replied. There is no friction. The problem is not that the gear is too tight. The problem is that the gear is too loose. The room fell silent. Arthur Pendelton stood up from his chair in the back row and slowly walked down the aisle, his eyes fixed on the teenage boy. Explain, Arthur commanded softly. Mateo picked up the box of matches. He struck one and lit the beeswax candle. A warm golden glow flickered to life, casting dancing shadows across the cold, sterile laboratory. Matteo held the candle carefully near the open chest of the automaton, letting the gentle heat radiate toward the brass gears. This machine was built in 1791. Matteo explained, his voice echoing in the quiet room. There were no climate-controlled laboratories back then. There were no freezing air conditioning vents or cold LED lights. When the maestro played, it played in grand ballrooms, lit by hundreds of burning candles, surrounded by crowds of warm people. The journalists stopped writing. They stared at the flickering candle. The master watchmaker who built this knew exactly how his materials behaved. Matteo continued, his eyes glowing with the deep understanding he had learned from Elias. He intentionally milled that specific brass pivot wheel just a fraction of a millimeter too small. He knew that in a warm, candlelit ballroom, the ambient heat would cause the brass to expand perfectly into place. Matteo turned to look at Julian Vance. Your laboratory is kept at a constant freezing 68 degrees to protect your computer servers. Under these cold lights, the antique brass shrinks. For the first 88 notes, the spring tension is low enough that the machine can handle the microscopic gap. But at note 89, the sonata requires a massive chord. The tension hits maximum capacity. Because the pivot wheel is cold and shrunken, it slips. It binds against the release valve, and the entire system locks down to prevent the gears from snapping. Julian Vance's jaw tightened. He looked at his 14 senior engineers. They were all staring at the floor or looking at each other in stunned realization. The theory was mathematically and scientifically flawless. It was a phantom variable that modern diagnostic software would never ever calculate. Computers only tested the machine as it existed in the present moment. They never tested the machine as it was meant to live. It is a fascinating story, Julian said, his voice rising in panic. A lovely little fairy tale about candles and ballrooms, but it is entirely unprovable. You cannot verify a microscopic thermal expansion variance without weeks of laboratory testing. I do not need weeks, Matteo said. He looked at the digital clock. 73 minutes remaining. I can prove it to you right now, and I can fix it in 10 minutes. Absolutely not, Julian Vance shouted, his voice cracking with panic. He stepped between Matteo and the glass case. I will not allow an uneducated child to shove his bare hands into a machine worth $30 million. The risk of catastrophic structural damage is far too high. This demonstration is over. Step aside, Julian. Arthur Pendelton did not raise his voice. He did not have to. The quiet, absolute authority in his tone made the entire room freeze. Arthur walked past the senior engineers and stood directly beside Matteo. He looked at Julian with eyes as cold and hard as frozen steel. This is my machine, Arthur said slowly. This is my wife's legacy. You have had 14 months to fix it, and you failed. The boy has 10 minutes. Let him work, or you will never work in this industry again. Julian swallowed hard. The color drained completely from his face. He slowly stepped back, his hands trembling with suppressed rage. Matteo turned to the table of specialized tools left by the engineers. He ignored the laser calipers and the ultrasonic probes. He looked at a junior technician who was sweating nervously in the front row. I need a single sheet of 24-karat gold leaf and a drop of organic clock oil, Matteo said calmly. Do you have that? The technician looked terrified, glancing at Julian, but then he quickly nodded and rushed to a supply cabinet. He returned seconds later with a delicate glass vial of oil and a thin paper folder containing the fragile gold leaf. Matteo took a deep breath. The digital clock on the wall read 68 minutes. He did not need them. He opened his faded canvas backpack and pulled out a pair of long, incredibly thin brass tweezers. They were antique, heavily scarred, and perfectly balanced. They were the tweezers Elias had given him when he fixed his first pocket watch. With extreme precision, Matteo cut a microscopic sliver of the gold leaf. It was so thin, it was almost transparent. He dipped the very edge of it into the organic oil. Then Matteo leaned over the open chest cavity of the celestial maestro. This was the moment of truth. The internal mechanics of the automaton were a dense, terrifying maze of razor-sharp brass teeth, tightly coiled springs, and delicate hairsprings. An adult hand could never navigate that labyrinth without accidentally snapping a critical component. But Matteo's hands were small. That was not a weakness. It was his greatest gift. He slid his hand deep inside the chest of the golden man. He did not look at the computer screens. He closed his eyes. He trusted his fingers. He felt the cold air of the laboratory. He found the tiny, shrunken pivot wheel that had caused all the pain. With a movement so steady and practiced, it seemed impossible for a 14-year-old Matteo used the tweezers to gently wrap the microscopic sliver of gold leaf around the base of the pivot wheel. The soft gold acted as a perfect thermal shim. It bridged the tiny gap created by the cold temperature of the modern laboratory. The organic oil secured it in place. It took exactly 4 minutes. Matteo carefully withdrew his hand. He placed the antique tweezers back into his backpack. He wiped his hands on his slacks and took a step back. "It is done," Matteo said quietly. "Please wind the main drive." The room was so silent you could hear the blood rushing in your own ears. Nobody breathed. Nobody moved. Arthur Pendelton nodded to the junior technician. The young man stepped forward with shaking hands, inserted the golden key into the back of the automaton, and wound the springs to their maximum tension. He stepped away. The celestial maestro awakened. Its golden chest expanded with a soft pneumatic breath. Its mechanical hands drifted gracefully over the wooden keys of the piano. The sonata began. The haunting, sweeping melody filled the sterile laboratory, but this time nobody was looking at the computer monitors. Every single eye in the room was fixed on the golden automaton. Note 50. The music swelled. Note 70. The tension in the room became almost unbearable. Note 80. Arthur Pendelton closed his eyes. His fists were clenched so tightly his knuckles were completely white. Note 85. Julian Vance held his breath, desperately praying for the machine to fail, praying for the sickly metallic click to save his reputation. Note 88. The golden hands hovered over the keys. The chest took a deep mechanical breath. The primary spring reached its absolute maximum tension. The entire room braced for the horrible grinding sound. Note 89. The fingers struck the keys. A massive, beautiful, perfect chord rang out. There was no click. There was no hesitation. The gear did not slip. The gold leaf shim held the pivot wheel perfectly in place. Note 90. Note 91. The celestial maestro kept playing. The music cascaded through the room like a rushing river of sound. The automaton moved with breathtaking, lifelike grace. Its head swayed gently to the rhythm. Its golden fingers danced across the entire keyboard, playing the most complex and rapid sections of the classical sonata without a single flaw. For the first time in 14 months, the song was completely free. Arthur Pendelton fell to his knees. The great billionaire, the man who controlled massive empires of data and technology, began to weep uncontrollably. The tears streamed down his face and fell onto the polished floor. He was not looking at a machine. He was looking at Eleanor. He could hear her voice in the music. He could feel her warmth in the room. The ghost was no longer trapped inside the gears. She was finally singing to him. The sonata played for a full 7 minutes. It was a masterpiece of human emotion and mechanical genius. When the final notes slowly faded into the air, the golden automaton bowed its head and fell perfectly still. The laboratory was dead silent. Matteo stood quietly beside the glass case. He looked at Arthur Pendelton crying on the floor. He knew that feeling. He knew the heavy weight of missing someone you loved. "She is not gone, Mr. Pendelton," Matteo whispered softly, his young voice carrying across the silent room. "The machine just needed someone to listen to her." The laboratory erupted. The 3 journalists scrambled out of their chairs shouting questions and snapping photographs. The 14 senior engineers, the men who had laughed at Matteo just an hour ago, were staring at the boy in absolute stunned reverence. Julian Vance looked like a man who had just watched his entire world burn to the ground. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The pristine, untouchable reputation he had built on arrogance and expensive computer servers had just been completely destroyed by a 14-year-old boy with a piece of paper and an antique stethoscope. Arthur Pendelton slowly stood up from the floor. He wiped the tears from his face. He looked at the golden automaton, its chest rising and falling in perfect silent rhythm, and then he turned to Matteo. The towering billionaire did not look down at the boy. He extended his hand outward, treating the teenage janitor as an absolute equal. "Thank you, Matteo," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. Matteo took the billionaire's hand. "You are welcome, sir." Arthur turned to Carlos, who was still standing by the wall, trembling with shock and pride. The father had risked his only job to stand by his son. "Carlos," Arthur said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who could change lives with a single sentence. "Your son has a profound gift. I know your wife is in the hospital. I know you are carrying a heavy burden. That ends today. I am personally covering all of her medical bills. And if you are willing, I need a new estate manager for my home. The salary will ensure you never have to sweep another floor again." Carlos collapsed against the wall, burying his face in his hands, weeping tears of pure relief. The crushing weight of poverty had just been lifted from his shoulders forever. Arthur turned back to Mateo. "And as for you, my young friend, I am establishing an educational trust in your name. Full funding for any engineering or restoration academy in the world. But more importantly, I want to meet this Elias Thorne. I want to build a school for him, a place where true restoration is taught, where people learn to listen." Mateo smiled, his dark eyes shining. "He would like that very much, Mr. Pendelton." The fall of Julian Vance happened with terrifying speed. The journalists published their stories the very next morning. The headline of the biggest engineering magazine in the country read, "Billionaire Spends Millions on Artificial Intelligence, Saved by 14-year-old with a Candle." But the public humiliation was only the beginning. Arthur Pendelton was a ruthless businessman when crossed. He ordered a massive independent forensic audit of the Vance Restoration Institute. What the auditors found was devastating. 14 months of service records, $3 million in charges, and detailed invoices for complex laser scans that achieved absolutely nothing. The audit revealed that Julian Vance's artificial intelligence models had actually flagged the temperature variance issue 6 months ago, but Julian had intentionally ignored it. Fixing the machine quickly did not make him any money, dragging the restoration out billing a grieving billionaire for endless useless software diagnostics was a massive source of profit. It was not just arrogance, it was deliberate fraud. The Antique Restoration Board revoked Julian's license immediately. 2 other luxury museums initiated their own audits. Lawyers circled like sharks. Within 1 month, the Vance Restoration Institute filed for bankruptcy. Julian Vance, the man who had demanded total perfection from his machines, was entirely broken by his own greed. 1 year later, a gentle snow fell outside the massive windows of a beautiful brick building in upstate New York. A bronze plaque above the heavy oak doors read, "The Elias Thorne Academy of Historical Restoration." Inside, the rooms did not look like sterile laboratories. They looked like massive, warm workshops. There were no harsh fluorescent lights, only the warm glow of amber lamps. Dozens of students sat at wooden benches, working on antique clocks, vintage engines, and delicate musical boxes. At the front of the main classroom sat Elias Thorne. The blind master rested in a comfortable leather chair, a peaceful smile on his face, listening to the beautiful symphony of ticking metal around him. Standing at the center table was 15-year-old Mateo Silva. He was no longer a frightened janitor's son trying to stay invisible. He was a master teacher. Surrounding him were 10 new students. Some were older engineers who had realized that computers could not solve everything. Some were young teenagers who, just like Mateo, saw the world a little differently. Mateo held up a heavy brass gear. It was the exact same gear Elias had shown him 5 years ago in that dark alleyway. "Forget everything your computers tell you," Mateo said to his students, his voice calm and confident. "Forget the lasers and the digital scans. Today we learn the real language of engineering." He placed the gear on the wooden table. Metal remembers. It scars. It breathes. It feels the cold, and it remembers the heat. Every machine in the world will tell you exactly what is wrong with it. The only question is whether you are humble enough to listen. Mateo Silva walked into a sterile laboratory holding a polishing rag. He walked out holding the future, not because someone powerful gave him permission, but because he completely refused to let arrogance silence his truth. If you have ever been underestimated, if you have ever been told you do not belong because of how you look or where you come from, this story is yours. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Julian Vance thought he was handing Mateo a dirty rag to put him in his place. What he actually handed him was a stage. 90 minutes later, that boy did not just fix a priceless historical artifact. He exposed a multi-million-dollar fraud and proved that true brilliance cannot be measured by a piece of paper on a wall. Here is the part that should make us all think. How many times do we walk past pure genius just because it is wearing the wrong clothes? How many times do we ignore a brilliant mind just because it speaks with the wrong accent or holds the wrong tools? Mateo spent years learning the deep emotional language of machinery in a dark alleyway. Nobody saw that brilliance. They just saw a poor kid holding a broom. So be honest with yourself. If a teenager in faded clothes walked up to you and claimed he could solve a problem that the greatest experts in the world could not, would you hand him a broom or would you let him listen? Tell me your answer in the comments below. Hit subscribe if you believe the talent does not need permission to change the world. Share this story right now because somewhere out there, another Mateo is holding a broom, just waiting to be heard.